Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition here of a very brief talk about the 25 de Abril, the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. Indeed, it is April 25th of 2022, and we are commemorating the 25 de Abril, the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. It happened exactly 48 years ago today. I'm going to share a screen and going to give some brief thoughts about the revolution. The screen that you're going to see, the presentation, is a PowerPoint presentation that was put forth by Commandant Jorge Betancourt. He was our guest here through the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute for a fascinating hour and 35 minutes about the Carnation Revolution. He used this PowerPoint. It was all in Portuguese. Our students from the Portuguese 1B course at Fresno State were present, and lots of you throughout the social media world as well, and those, of course, who speak Portuguese. But I thought we would give you a very brief synopsis of the revolution itself, where in the English language, for those who, of course, do not speak Portuguese, but are of Portuguese background and want to know more about the history of the land of their forefathers, or those who have heard of the revolution, maybe their parents or their grandparents or immigrants, and didn't acquire much information about the revolution that changed Portugal forever. So it is the slide that you see here, of course, has some images of the revolution with the title Mais Cravos do que Ditadura, a bit more of the carnations and less, of course, of dictatorship. And that is the first slide. Again, this presentation is from the Associação 25 de Abril and presented here through PBBI at Fresno State by Commander Jorge Betancourt. And so he started, of course, with this wonderful poem by Jorge de Sena, a poem, of course, about freedom, about the need of freedom. And Jorge de Sena, by the way, as some of you might know, taught at literature at the University of California in Santa Barbara, where he lived the latter part of his life, where he had a very active teaching career, and indeed also a very active contact with the Portuguese American community throughout the state of California. A little bit of the chronology about what led to the events and how the Commander Jorge Betancourt talked about his presentation around 25 de Abril. So the Estado Novo, or new state, the dictatorial regime, began in 1933. Of course, 1945 was the end of the Second World War. In 1968, Salazar was substituted. He had a stroke and became very ill, and they were substituted by Marcelo Caetano. The revolution itself took place in April 25th of 1974. And then we talk a little bit about significant dates after the revolution: the 11th of March of 75, the 25th of April of 75, the elections for the very first assembly, free elections in Portugal, the November 25th of 1975 event, and then on the April 2nd of 1976, the adaptation of the Portuguese constitution. So what was this new state, or Estado Novo? It was basically a dictatorial regime of a one political party, corporativist regime, autocratic. It had governed Portugal for 41 years, so from 1933 until 1974. And Estado Novo took over after we had a military dictatorship in Portugal that came forth on the 28th of May of 1926, that put the end to the 16-year experience of the First Republic. So how was really Portugal before the 25th of April of 1974? Lots of immigration. Okay, many of you who are in the Portuguese American community, especially the younger generation, it was probably your grandparents that came. certainly to the United States in the late 50s, 60s, and even throughout the 1970s till the revolution and a little bit after. Immigration to the United States from to California, especially, I should say, from the archipelagos of the Azores and Madeira and from northern Portugal, kind of ceased a couple of years after the revolution. So around 77, ceased, it dropped significantly at the end of 76 and 77, but continued a little bit. And then it basically kind of ceased to California in the beginning of the 1980s, so about 40 years ago. To the east coast of the United States, we still had, especially from mainland Portugal, some significant numbers in the 1980s and even early 1990s. So lots of immigration, lots of repression, no civil liberties, only one political party, no other political parties existed, and of course the wars, the colonial wars in Africa. That's basically what marked the April 20, the time before the April 25th revolution. Here's a depiction of a little bit of what might be known as a perfect family in Portugal at the time. You can see there it says Eleição de Salazar, and of course, very, very poor family, but the depiction was God, homeland, and family, a perfect trilogy. And the depiction, of course, was that people were poor, but people were happy. And so immigration, as those of you who read Portuguese can see some of the items that are listed here. Again, this presentation is by a presentation from the 25 de Abril Association that was put forth in Portuguese with a lot more finesse and a lot more information by Commander Jorge Betancourt, a part of a PBBI event that we had a few days ago to commemorate the 25 de Abril. We're here to give you a synopsis of it on the 25 de Abril, on the date itself of the Carnation Revolution, to bring it to the Portuguese American community and those who are not Portuguese American but have heard or are interested in the Carnation Revolution. So basically, between 1950 and 1974, between 1.5 to 2 million Portuguese left Portugal, either to different parts of Europe or to the Americas, mainly North America, mainly the United States and Canada. There were lots, of course, of the living conditions were horrible in Portugal, not just in the Azores, Madeira, but also in different parts of mainland Portugal, especially some of the rural part. The agriculture sector had been stagnated. No development was being done. And so basically it was a way for Portuguese that didn't have economic opportunities to immigrate to countries that needed a labor force. And of course, the repressive regime and the colonial wars in Africa did not help that at all. One thing to mention is that, as you see there in the third part in Portuguese, is that the immigration was used by the regime. First of all, it kind of adjusted the labor market. It kind of attenuated some of the social tensions, and the immigrants would send money back to Portugal. And that was an important part of the Portuguese economy. That the money, the income brought by the immigrants was important to the people and the balance of the economic situation in Portugal for payments, and of course to help finance the war in Africa as well. This picture depicts a little bit of, if you look at the left side one there, this is Lisbon, and this is by a famous photographer from France. And if you look right here in 1964, this is in Paris, in some of the so-called ghettos where the Portuguese lived. And so you can see there wasn't much of a difference here. You see these young girls in Lisbon in 1966, and then you see in 1964 families, Portuguese families, and their living conditions as they immigrated to different parts of the world. So good. Back a little bit. This here that Commander Georges Betancourt shared with us is basically one of the profiles, of the many profiles, of the literally thousands and thousands of profiles, I would say millions, that were basically kept by the PIDE for people who some of the simplest things that they took as an offense to the state. And of course, Portugal, under the 25 de Abril, the issue, as I said, with wars. So with the end of the Second World War, as all of us know, we came upon two superpowers, United States and the elapsed Soviet Union, and most of the European powers were compelled and basically were mandated to recognize the independence of their so-called colonies in Asia and in Africa. And Portugal did not do that. So this is a map that has all of the different parts of Portugal still, even 20 years after the Second World War. And it was used by the regime, by the Salazar regime, to promote within Portugal and the Portuguese idiosyncrasy how great and how big Portugal was. So they did this kind of perverted system where they would take as you can see, here's Portugal right there, the west coast of Africa, of Europe, sorry about that, of Europe. And of course, as you can see there, they took some African countries, now African countries, then African provinces, and from Asia as well, and they put them here, and especially Guinea and Mozambique and Angola. And the idea was to promote to the Portuguese that the Portuguese nation was just as large as all of Europe. And so if you look at some of the population, for example, that the Commander Georges Betancourt shared with us in Mozambique, some of the ethnic groups, and look at 1960, and look at the white ethnicity, the white race. Basically, there were only 97,000 in a population of almost 7 million. The majority, of course, were Africans, but yet they'd had no rights and they had no political power. Of course, they basically, the colonists controlled everything. So starting in 1961, the winds of a possible liberation of the colonies and have, of course, these colonies, these regions set up as independent countries, controlling, of course, their own destiny, began basically in 1961. And for 13 years, Portugal had a war in three fronts: in Guinea, now Guinea-Bissau, in Angola, and Mozambique. And so it was quite a war for Portugal. The music you hear, of course, is about the march off to war, and the pictures are, as you can see, of the young soldiers going off to war. And then we have the war in Africa with a few pictures here showing off, of course, depicting some of the brutal aspects of the war. All wars are brutal, and of course some of the issues that were happening there. A little bit about what the war meant, and so the military service we had a draft, was mandated, it was mandatory, a 4-year service, of which you did about 2 years in the war scene. And so in the 13 years, more than 800,000 young men served in the Portuguese colonial war. 8,831 military folks died, men in Portugal in the war. These were broken down, as you can see, by about 3,400, 3,455 in Angola, 2,240 in Guinea, and 36 in Mozambique. And here's the different forces of the armed forces, how of course, the Army had the biggest losses with 8,290, the Air Force 346, the Navy 195. Over 30,000 were evacuated in very debilitated health conditions. Over 100,000 with different, of course, with different issues with their health. 14,000, of course, suffered tremendous suffers of casualties to their health as well, physical aspects, and quite a few, over 140,000 with, of course, neurotic issues, issues that affected many who were in the colonial wars from Portugal, from the islands, both the regional archipelagos and, of course, mainland Portugal. And so in 1974, April 25th of 1974, the revolution put an end to the Estado Novo and put an end to the dictatorship that was basically an almost half a century dictatorship. As you can see, António de Oliveira Salazar, 1933 to 1968, Marcelo Caetano from 1968 to 1974. So I'm not going to spend a lot on this because I think that we could do a session on the second part itself. I wanted to bring you up to how Portugal was before the April 25th of 1974 revolution, and thus the importance of us in the Portuguese American diaspora, and I would say the Portuguese diaspora all over the world, to commemorate this event and to pass it on to future generations. And the war itself, the immigration, and the economical status of Portugal, all of these affected tremendously, of course, Portugal before April 25th of 1974. And many of those who are now in the Portuguese American communities and the Portuguese Canadian communities that came before 1974 or around that particular time, of course, it was a direct effect, as we mentioned here in this presentation by Commander Jorge Betancourt, a direct effect of the Estado Novo, of the new state. And in this part of the presentation, just very, very briefly, this talked about the process that the Movimento das Forças Armadas, the Armed Forces movement, took forth. So it wasn't just all of a sudden on April 24th, they woke up and they said, let's have a revolution tomorrow. This began, and of course it began, it was kind of cooking in the process in the late 60s, especially in the early 70s, but this particular coup that NBC News, in a piece done for the 40th anniversary in 2014 of the revolution, called it the coolest coup, military coup in all the world. This, of course, took place and began, as you can see there, in 1973, and it continued. And these were the three main figures that were in charge of different parts of the program of the armed forces movement. So we have Melo Antunes, who was in charge of the political objectives and the political program. Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, in charge of the operations. And Garcia dos Santos, in charge of the broadcasts and how to communicate, because that indeed was very important. Here we see a little bit of the routes that was put forth in order to have communications. Here is a poem by José Jorge Latria, who is actually the president of the Sociedade Portuguesa de Autores, the Portuguese Authors Association, about the Day of Liberty in Portugal. There's a little bit of the military operations that actually took place from different parts. It wasn't just all of a sudden one battalion from somewhere in Portugal. It was a coordinated effort. Here is basically the operational centers, and this is a picture, of course, taken after the fact, as they were commemorating the 25 de Abril, and the key figures: Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, Garcia dos Santos, Sanches Osório, Fischer Lopes Pires, Hugo dos Santos, and Victor Crespo. And so a little bit of the different aspects of the operation and the different songs that were played in Portugal, on the radio, I should say, for basically to have this go as smoothly as they wanted this to go. I wanting to end this presentation because I promised you that it would be brief, and it was basically about the up to the 25 de Abril. We will revisit Commanders Jorge Betancourt and the Associação 25 de Abril's awesome presentation and talk to you a little bit about the songs and a little bit about the actual day itself, and hopefully have the commander back on with us. He does speak English, and we could talk a little bit about some of these aspects of the revolution. So today is indeed a very special day for Portugal. Just wanted to share also some of the pictures that the commander shared with us. These were actual pictures of the events, all of the different aspects that were brought up on Lisbon that day. Folks asked people not to go into the streets, but as you'll see in a little bit, people got very excited and got into the streets, and of course the Portuguese curiosity about what was going on. And basically by the end of the day, in the next few days, people were of course in the streets right along with the soldiers, very excited to see this revolution be put forth. These are iconic pictures from the 25 de Abril revolution. That indeed changed Portugal forever. Here's a poem by the great Portuguese poet Sofia de Melo Breiner Anderson, dedicated to one of the heroes of the revolution, and that was Salgueiro Maia. And so here's a picture, of course, of the armed forces already inside some of the government buildings that they were trying to control. The press at the time, as Forças Armadas tomaram o poder, so the armed forces have taken power in Portugal. One of the things that actually the NBC News on that piece, the coolest military coup, talked about is the return of all the exiles, the liberation of the political prisoners. And then, of course, what followed were elections in 1975, free elections. And look at those pictures. Look at the pictures of the excitement of people. It was one of the most participative elections in Portugal since the democracy came to Portugal. And people stood in line literally for hours and hours and hours. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how we look at it, it happens in the United States sometimes, but it's because of the rules and the regulations that are put forth in some states. But in Portugal, people were just very, very excited, and they stood in line for hours and hours to vote. The Constitution of 1976, of course, consolidated the Portuguese democracy. Decolonization, which in some aspects did not run as smoothly as one wanted to be, but these 5 independent countries where colonies became independent countries in Africa. There were lots of folks who returned from Portugal, from the now independent countries to Portugal, and it kind of brought some economic chaos, of course, to their lives for sure, but to the country itself. So could decolonization have been done differently? Possibly, but it was just, it had to be done. And it was basically, it should have been done basically 20 years earlier. So it wouldn't have had the issue that we had with a 13-year war. But some of the development that happened in Portugal was really astonishing. And if you look here, the mortality rates, look at the mortality rate in 1962 and look at it as it goes down to the 2000s, to 2012 here. The same thing, the minimum wage and how it fluctuated and how in relation to the cost of things. So it has really, Portugal is not a perfect country by any means, but it is, the life in Portugal is much, much, much different than, of course, than it was in the 1960s and the 1970s up to the April 25th of 1974 revolution. Some social progress that was done, of course, human rights, the rights of women, the rights of children, the rights of those with disabilities. All of these things were implemented. They did not exist before 1974. In the presentation that the commander does, he puts this picture, and this is good old days at the Tulare Union High School. Every year I commemorated, when I taught for 22 years, the Carnation Revolution. Sometimes I took on too much, as probably this presentation does as well, and maybe bored some of the students because it was taught extensively. They created posters. They talked a little bit about the 25 de Abril. And this one was from my last year teaching at Tulare Union High School. This was done in 2018, but we did it when we had the commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the 25 de Abril, the 30th, the 35th. We had different symposiums. When I did a symposium in Tulare, the Filaments of the Atlantic Heritage, one of them where we had key figures from Portugal, from not just the revolution, but also from the arts come, and our students created lots of different posters and were able to learn some of the intricacies of the revolution. So it was part of of my teaching journey at Tulare Joint Union High School District, and I thank him for using that picture in his presentation that he makes in Portugal. Of course, then in 1986, Portugal joined the European Union. Things changed immensely after that. There's, of course, some thoughts about the European Union, but it definitely was a plus for all of Portugal. So what is the 25th of April? What is the 25 de Abril? Liberty, liberty, and liberty. Basically, the freedoms that it brought to Portugal, the freedoms that it brought to the country, and the opportunities, equality, solidarity. These are all education for all, healthcare for all. These are all concepts. These were all issues that were conquered, let's put it that way, with the 25 de Abril revolution. Thank you all for joining us. It is a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks to the 25 de Abril Association for letting me share this with you. Thanks to Commander Jorge Betancourt for his and his colleagues, his comrades. They do an excellent job going from school to talk about the 25 de Abril in Portugal. And I think that we need to do more of that here in the Portuguese diaspora, here in the Portuguese communities in the United States. I'm actually at University of California in Santa Barbara to be part of a presentation that will happen today, here in just a couple of hours. Hopefully you can tune in because it'll be available on Zoom. And so as we put forth, and hopefully it's the beginning of more and more commemorations that we continue to do at all levels. And I think we need to put a strategic plan in place to bring it to all levels of the Portuguese American community and the community at large in the United States of America. For many years, when I taught at Tulare Union High School, we took a group up to Berkeley with the collaboration of Dr. Diolinda Adão, who did a phenomenal job there for many years as she directed the Center of Portuguese Studies. And together with her and I and Professor José Luís Silva, sometimes also our friends from Turlock High School and Hillmore High School, we put together many different events, later with Professor Luis from San Jose. And so we put together quite a few events that were enlightening and very enlightening for our students. And hopefully we can continue doing that at various levels. Obviously, times are different today. Things are very different, but with technology and with quite a bit of will from both sides of the Atlantic, we can continue to commemorate, not just commemorate today as we're doing here right now, but to commemorate all year long and do a series of events throughout the month of April, especially to bring forth the spirit of April to the Portuguese American experience in California, certainly, but I would say throughout the United States, throughout Canada, throughout the entire diaspora. Thank you all. Viva 25 de Abril. Thank you all for attending. On behalf of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute from California State University, Fresno, happy 25th of April, 25 de Abril, o dia da revolução, a revolução dos escravos, the Carnation Revolution.